Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. For those of you whom I have not yet had the chance to meet, my name is Safier, and I have just started this week as the new director of the John Carter Brown Library. I don't know what the library thinks, but I personally couldn't be more thrilled about what the future holds for the collection. Its place as an 18th century collection that sits at the vanguard of the 21st with many plans for expanding its role and its collections. The library's role in supporting path-breaking scholarship on the history of the Americas, from indigenous languages and cultures to environmental history. And I hope an increasingly luminous place as a beacon for scholarship and the public humanities more broadly. As fellows, former fellows, and perhaps even maybe some yet-to-be fellows in the audience, as well as library associates, local community members, and friends of Brown, I look forward to meeting you and sharing with you some of my own ideas about how we're planning to move the library in new directions while maintaining its prestige as one of the premier repositories of its kind in the US and indeed in the world. I must say also that it is a particular privilege for me, as in my first public activity here, to be presiding over such an extraordinary conjuncture of events, beginning with this evening's lecture. But before I get to introducing our speaker, let me say how excited the library and its staff are to be hosting the exhibition that is currently on display in the Macmillan Reading Room. This exhibit, which is entitled Sugar and the Visual Imaginations in the Atlantic World, circa 1600 to 1860, emphasizes strategies of visual representation, as its title suggests. And it focuses on ways of graphically representing the Atlantic sugar complex in its surprisingly diversified manner. The exhibition's graphic orientation showcases not only the broad collection of the library and its range, but more importantly, I think, is the capacity of the JCB's materials to act as a catalyst for stimulating questions that push the scholarly landscape in new and, I hope, challenging directions. The exhibition not only interrogates the role of visual culture in co-constructing ideas about conflict and commerce in the region, but it also prompts us, I think, to ask larger questions about how traditional geographical nodes and regions, such as Jamaica, Barbados, and Suriname, interacted with one another and other larger circuits as well, including such far-flung sites as India and the Middle East. Cartographic sources on display in the in the exhibition demonstrate how new tools of measurement that highlighted crop organization and territorial divisions can also be used by scholars to gauge environmental degradation and deforestation that may otherwise be hidden. And literary sources, alongside engravings and broadsheets, help us to reflect on what we might call the dulcet imaginary of early Atlantic commercial culture, a culinary fusion of cane, commodity fetishism, and outright conflict that inflicted an enormous price not only on individual lives, but also on global empires. So alongside this visually striking exhibition that has been curated magnificently by Diane Criss of the Art History Department and mounted expertly by our own Susan Danforth, the library is especially pleased to be hosting Beyond Sweetness, New Histories of Sugar in the Early Atlantic World. And I'd like to take this opportunity to officially welcome the conference participants to this weekend's events. It is a hallmark of the JCB that exhibitions and academic programs work in tandem with one another, jointly enhancing each other's work, and in this case, I think, both will allow us to see how more recent trends in cultural history, material culture, and global connections intersect with what has always been a mainstay topic in Atlantic literature. And looking over the program for the events of the next couple of days, which includes topics ranging from Chinese contract laborers who are working on 19th century Cuban sugar plantations, to how different forms of agricultural dynamics interacted with, between sugar and other products such as mahogany and cotton. I am convinced that we are going to have a very, very dynamic and stimulating set of days. The conference, which was the brainchild of a team that was comprised by Julie Kim, Chris Iannini, Tony Bogues, Diane Chris, Jeremy Mumford, and Margot Nishimura, will probe the vast and interconnected threads woven together by sugar's sweet shadow. And with the backdrop of the exhibition, we look forward to teasing out some of those connections even more. There's no single scholar that I could imagine being better suited to help us bring together these disparate yet integrated threads than Stuart Schwartz, whose own work has ambitiously stretched across geographic and thematic divides that few, even in today's scholarly world that rewards great geographical and interdisciplinary ambition, would dare to cross. Currently, George Burton Adams Professor of History at Yale University, Professor Schwartz's trajectory took him from Middlebury College and the UNAM in Mexico City to Columbia University, where he received his PhD, and eventually to Minnesota, where he made his way through the professorial ranks for more than 20 years before moving to New Haven. During that period, he published a series of groundbreaking books and articles, sometimes alone, at other times collaborating with leading scholars in his and other related fields. But what is particularly striking is the broad range of many of these titles, and in looking over them, I was also struck at how many titles I had come across had relied upon in my own work, not only scholarly, but also in terms of teaching and in other areas. From his earliest work on the High Court of Bahia and judicial culture in colonial Brazil, he moved on to studying many topics that were important at particular moments in the last several decades. Formative to me in my own work was a volume entitled Implicit Understandings, the encounter between Europeans and other peoples in the early modern era, a title which I think, even though a lot of work has been done on that, still is very stimulating. As well as his English language edition of João Capistrano de Abreu's Capítulos da História Colonial in Brazil, for which he wrote an illuminating introduction to one of Brazil's foundational historiographical texts. He famously edited the Cambridge History of Native Peoples of the Americas with the anthropologist Frank Solomon, and even in doing so earned the accolade of being accused by none other than Claude Lévi-Strauss of being a genocidal historian. I mean, how many people in this room can lay claim to that? And perhaps most germane to this meeting, he published Sugar Plantations and the Formation of Brazilian Society, published by Cambridge University Press in 1985, which was an ambitious study of the Recôncavo Baiano that showcases the social aspects of sugar production and the relationships between owners and laborers in the productive process, a book that I'm sure we will be referring back to over the course of the next several days. Professor Schwartz's most recent book, I think it's his most recent book, is also the one that I know well, All Can Be Saved. I read it with great care after it swept all of the American Historical Association's prizes for 2009 that I had been hoping that my book would win. But alas, books like Professor Schwartz's are so impeccably conceived, broadly written, and ambitiously construed that it rightly garnered incredible praise. So it is an honor for me to introduce him, and I think it is a privilege for us to have him with us tonight at the beginning of this conference to give a talk entitled Hot Lands and Cold Lands, a Caribbean Search for the New Brazil in the Later 17th Century. And if my intuition from reading his title is not entirely off here, his lecture will touch on two themes that I hope the library will be developing over the next coming years. The first is seeing Brazil, or seeing other kinds of geographical concepts, in a much broader perspective. In this case, Brazil is part of a larger Caribbean world, something that Amazonian historians, archaeologists, and ethnolinguists have been arguing for some time. And importantly, something that pushes us back to a time when Carib peoples were migrating throughout a larger circum-Atlantic world. So there's a temporal as well as a spatial component that I think is very important. The second area is something that is also one of his current passions, which is environmental history. That is the use of historical materials to understand how human societies at different times conceived of their own relationships to natural conditions and circumstances that surrounded them. These kinds of ambitious questions are precisely those that have motivated Professor Schwartz's work over the longue durée, and what make his presentations as stimulating to hear today as they were when I first heard him as a graduate student some 15 odd years ago. Professor Schwartz will be taking a couple of questions anyway after his lecture, but if you don't get a chance to ask questions, I encourage you to come over and join us in the Macmillan Reading Room to take a look at the exhibition that is held there and to raise a glass to celebrate the opening of this conference and the lecture by our guest speaker. And with that, and very enthusiastically, I turn the podium over and ask you to join me in welcoming Stuart Schwartz. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I apologize about the book, and I'm very happy to be here tonight at the beginning of this conference on sugar. I've had a look at the exhibit already, and it's really sensational. I'm very happy to have had a chance to see it, and I know all of you will enjoy it as well. I'm technically arranged here now, so let's see if this works. Amsterdam, never. Amsterdam, perhaps. Recife, never. So spoke with incredulity the Dutch captives of the Portuguese in Goa when they were informed in 1654 that Dutch Brazil had fallen to the Portuguese. But the truth was that in the summer heat, on the 26th of January, 1654, the High Council of Dutch Brazil, under siege and without hope of relief, had signed the surrender that returned Brazil to the Portuguese control. To some extent, abandoned by authorities in Holland and a nearly bankrupt West India Company, the Dutch-Brazilian sugar colony had come to an end after only a brief quarter century of existence. Later, the epic of Dutch Brazil would be romanticized into a kind of Camelot on the Capibaribe, where Count Moritz of Nassau would be romanticized into the King Arthur of Dutch Brazil. Nassau, remember, was the man who Charles Boxer called a Renaissance prince in the New World. But in fact, Dutch Brazil had been, in effect, an attempt at vertical integration to consolidate the commercial aspects of the traditional Dutch sugar trade with the cultivation and production of sugar. Here's a map of Pernambuco in the period just before Dutch Brazil, where you can see the sugar plantations laid out on the rivers and the port of Recife, here, where the ships gathered around it. Even though few Hollanders had in fact learned to make sugar, and most remained dependent on the Portuguese or Luso-Brazilian partners or workers, the system had worked for a while with the financing of the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch era, however, was ultimately only a parenthesis in Brazil's history. But both within Brazil itself and throughout the Atlantic world, the effects of its rise and fall were long-lasting, and the march of sugar into the Caribbean exerted great influence on the remainder of the 17th century and long thereafter. It's now become a commonplace to think of the Atlantic world in a more integrated fashion, and most historians of British America understand that the history of the West Indies should be tied to the history of the continental colonies. But in many ways, the geographical and environmental similarities between the South Atlantic and the West Indian islands and coasts of the Greater Caribbean often made those regions rivals, competitors, and sometimes models for each other. In that linkage, the history of sugar, the history of slavery, conquest, empire, and settlement all played vital roles in what we might call the creation of plantation America. Let us imagine for a moment taking the point of a compass and placing it on Barbados. Here's a view of the governor's arrival in Barbados at the end of the 17th century. Let's put our compass on Bridgetown and then draw a great circle. This circular Greater Caribbean region lies physically and conceptually at the core of the Atlantic world, and the weight of its past still burdens much of the region. Dakar and the West African coast lie 4,545 kilometers to the east, and Mexico City 4,288 kilometers to the west. To the south, the great port of Rio de Janeiro is 4,380 kilometers distant, and the sugar zones of Bahia and Pernambuco, centers of the slave trade and of sugar production in the 17th century, lie some 700 to 1,200 kilometers closer to Barbados. To the north, the Chesapeake marks the northern boundary of the slave and tobacco economy. Washington, D.C. is some 3,325 kilometers from Bridgetown. But Florida and Louisiana, the continental centers of the 19th century sugar growing, fall within the perimeter of our circle. Certainly slaves labored and plantations flourished in the rimlands beyond these limits, or the limits of this great circle. And the colonial authorities of Madrid and London, or Amsterdam and Copenhagen and Paris all lived beyond the circle's perimeter. But in a way, Barbados was a geographic center of an Atlantic plantation world that had a brutally consistent history of slavery and often the deadly demography that defined it in the Americas. The story of sugar in plantation America is not an easy story to tell because of the truly transatlantic and even global nature of that story, and because the complex shifting political relations between the United Provinces, England, Spain, and Portugal for that century, roughly between 1580 and 1680, when there were times of truce that looked like war and times of war that seemed more like peace. We must keep in mind the overlapping stories of the continuing war of the United Provinces against the Spanish Habsburgs, the dynastic union of Spain and Portugal from 1580 to 1640, which then provoked the Dutch attacks on the Portuguese Empire, leading to the occupation of northeastern Brazil from 1630 to 54, and then the rebellion of Portugal against Spain and its subsequent struggle for independence from 1640 to 1668, in times in alliance with the Dutch and in times with hostility against the Dutch. In the history of Brazil, the last half of the 17th century was a time of troubles, epidemics, droughts, and political unrest. The Dutch episode had set in motion a series of processes that would determine the nature of the colony for the next century. The causes were general, but their effects were strongly regional. The fundamental key, of course, was sugar and its exhausting labor. Here's a Brazilian sugar mill from the 17th century, painted by the Dutch artist Frans Post. And here the work of sugar. These images taken in the 1970s, late 1970s, in Pernambuco. A lot of sugar harvesting now is done by mechanized harvesting, but there are still places where it is done by hand, and it is still backbreaking and difficult labor. The history of the price of sugar is a key to this story. It doesn't explain everything, but without it, the story is very difficult to explain at all. The great expansion of the sugar economy and the high price for sugar in the early 17th century had made Pernambuco Brazil's wealthiest captaincy, and thus a logical target for the West India Company in 1630. But sugar's price decline, beginning in the mid-1640s, later forced the West India Company to pressure its debtors in Pernambuco, that is the Luso-Brazilian planters, and that had precipitated their rebellion. It was also sugar's falling price that had made the Dutch willing to abandon the costly defense of the colony in return for other concessions from the Portuguese. And sugar continued to be the backdrop after 1654. It began a long price decline that you can see on this map from the height here in the mid-1640s, falling down here towards the end of the 17th century. In the London market, Brazilian sugar was priced at 119 shillings per hundredweight in 1643, but only 56 in 1683. And by the 1680s, the price of Brazilian sugar was about a third of its level in the 1650s. So you have this falling sugar price. And even though it began to recover in the 1690s, that recovery was only modest. Pernambuco, battered by war and burdened by taxation, never regained its position as the leading sugar captaincy and was overtaken by Bahia. The fall of sugar revenues and the shortage of hard currency led to a general economic crisis after 1670. Portugal responded by sending out expeditions in search of gold and silver in places like southern Africa and in Brazil, and also by devaluating its currency. As sugar prices were falling, the cost of living was rising in Brazil, and the price of labor, slaves, was rising very rapidly. To support its Brazilian colony, the Dutch seized São Jorge de Minas in 1637 and Luanda in 1641 on the West African coast. But about 25,000 Africans were brought to Dutch Brazil between 1637 and 45. And after 1654, with their expulsion from their base in Curacao, the Dutch became purveyors of slaves to the rest of the Caribbean. And while never the main purveyor, they became suppliers to the Spanish, the English, and the French. The rise of the Dutch as consumers and providers of African workers challenged the stability of the Portuguese Atlantic system. Although the Luso-Brazilians retook Luanda in 1648, the Dutch remained in control of Elmina. A new Atlantic system was emerging, and by the mid-century, all the colonies of plantation America would have agreed with the principle that underlay the statement of the Luso-Brazilian Jesuit Padre Antonio Vieira, who said, and many of his contemporaries agreed that, without Angola, no slaves. Without slaves, no sugar. Without sugar, no Brazil. And others would have added, without Brazil, no Portugal, because the Portuguese war for independence against Spain was being paid for by the sugar revenues that were being produced by the colony. The war to conquer northeastern Brazil and then the 9-year revolt against the Dutch destabilized the Brazilian sugar economy. Both sides burned ingenuous and cane fields. Planters and capital fled from Pernambuco. The Dutch seized hundreds of Portuguese sugar ships. And during this period, great numbers of slaves ran off from the plantations. The fugitive community of Palmares had existed before 1630 when the Dutch arrived, but it swelled in this period, despite the attempts by both the Dutch and the Portuguese to suppress it. Only in 1697 was the fugitive community eventually destroyed after many campaigns against what the Portuguese came to call the Dutch of another color, meaning the escaped slaves of Brazil. But this struggle, like plague and drought and war, was simply another of the calamities that plagued northeastern Brazil in the second half of the 17th century. And worst of all, Portugal, in order to expel the Dutch and then to gain its independence from Spain, had to tax the sugar industry. And it was a burden that made Brazil's recovery difficult. And so it's this half-century, roughly from 1655 to 1700, that the Atlantic world was reshaped through war, alliances, political and dynastic crises, economic restructuring, and through the processes of colonization and migration on a global scale. This is when the Caribbean became the core of the Atlantic sugar world. The Dutch experiment in northeastern Brazil had created alternatives and opportunities outside the Portuguese Empire. That stimulus attracted the hopes of other nations and individuals who sought to exploit the crisis of Portuguese Brazil in order to supplant or to emulate it by creating new plantation colonies. In many ways, the second half of the 17th century was characterized not only within Brazil, but elsewhere in the Atlantic world as well, by a desire to find a new Brazil, in both a real and in a metaphorical sense. That is, a great and profitable tropical colony growing sugar based on coerced labor of Africans that would enable the dreams of wealth and power to be realized. Throughout the Caribbean, this search for a new Brazil was now a major occupation. The Spaniards had already produced sugar on Hispaniola in Puerto Rico and Cuba in the 16th century, but those producers had been unable to compete with the Brazilian colony, and their production had remained essentially stagnant. New Spain and Peru, sugar production had thrived in order to supply the growing urban populations in Mexico City and Lima. But now, after 1640, there were new opportunities. For traditional producers like Cuba, expansion began to take place in the 1630s, when slaves were readily available from Portuguese suppliers. This fell off a bit after the 1640s with the break with Portugal, but then surged again in the 1650s and 60s, driven by good prices, improving prices, and the regularity of the fleet system. By the late 1660s, the surge in Cuba ended as fleets became irregular, and European prices began to fall again. Spanish government taxes on Cuban sugar rose, and most of all, competition from other Caribbean islands increased. When, at the end of the century, however, the Havana Town Council wrote to the King of Spain that, as they said, the sugars of Brazil, Virginia, Jamaica, Curacao, and Barbados should be prohibited in Spain, they were clearly confused about the exact location of where these sugars were coming from, because Curacao and Virginia weren't producing sugar, but they were right about the nature of their problem. That is, the competition coming from other nations' sugar production. Colonization had already begun on some of the smaller islands of the Caribbean, like Barbados and the Leewards, or Martinique and Guadeloupe, in the 1630s. While Dutch Brazil was still flourishing. But these had been settlements of small farmers and indentured laborers, producing cotton, tobacco, and minor staples. While sugarcane was already known in these places, it was not until the high prices of the 1630s and early 1640s that sugar began to supplant the other island crops in importance, at times doing so with lightning speed. To a large extent, the full transition to sugar in these places was a direct result of the 1645 rising of the Luso-Brazilian colonists against the Dutch in Brazil. The difficulties of the Dutch opened new opportunities for their Caribbean competitors. The story is thought to be better known than probably it really is. The early references of Richard Ligon about Barbadian planters sending to Pernambuco for sugar plantings, or of Dutch merchant investors or of Portugal Negroes who came to the island, have led to an interpretation that seemed to make the Dutch and Dutch Brazil the primary stimulus of the Barbadian shift to sugar. The Hollanders provided, said one English observer, Negroes, copper stills, and other things pertaining to the ingenious, the mills. Another man, Robert Harley, a planter and chancellor of Barbados, said in 1667 that the Dutch losing Brazil, many Dutch and Jews repairing to Barbados began planting and making sugar. And he added that without Brazil, the Dutch then sold the slaves from their outposts in Guinea to Barbados. This was the first rise of that plantation that makes it able to subsist and to traffic. Sephardic refugees from Dutch Brazil, experienced in the sugar trade, had an impact on the sugar economy of the island. Moreover, the Dutch and English merchants by the 1650s were supplying credit and slaves. the numbers of which had grown in Barbados from 6,000 in 1645 to over 80,000 by 1668. Similar tales were told on other islands, like the French portion of St. Kitts, where after 1648 sugar planting began under the direction of an exile from Brazil, or in the rest of the French Antilles, where 600 Jewish refugees from Pernambuco in Europe arrived in 1645. Another major point to keep in mind is that after 1648 and the end of the 30 Years' War, with the termination of hostilities between the United Provinces and Spain, Dutch trade was now burgeoning in the Caribbean. So whatever happened in Barbados, or in the similar, somewhat later story in French Martinique or Guadeloupe, was due not only to the fall of Dutch Brazil, but to broader political and economic conditions in the Atlantic. Overall, however, the second half of the century witnessed a considerable expansion of Dutch maritime activity in the Atlantic as the pattern of sugar and slaves expanded, even though it did not result in the creation of an Atlantic empire for the Dutch. Parallel to, and partly a cause of this activity, was the increasingly restrictive mercantilist policies of France and England, created to restrict markets for the new sugar colonies and close the mother countries to competitive Brazilian products. In the 1630s, 80% of the sugar sold in London had been grown in Brazil. By 1690, only 10% was grown in Brazil. The English, and to the lesser extent the French planters, groaned under the increasing tax burdens that were laid on them by the mother countries, but they were assured a closed market that began to generate large profits and stimulated further expansion. Brazilian planters just couldn't keep pace. Brazil still had the greatest productive capacity. The captaincy of Bahia alone could produce more than any Caribbean competitor, but the industry was heavily taxed to support the continuing war for independence, the indemnity to Holland, and for the dowry to pay for the marriage of Catherine of Braganza to Charles II of England. By the 1680s, Brazil seemed to be on its last legs. But of course, as the Brazilians say, Deus é brasileiro, God is a Brazilian. And God sent the gold of Minas Gerais in the 1690s that once again changed the colony's trajectory. Throughout this Atlantic world, Brazil was the first tropical Babylon. It served as a prototype to be emulated, copied, or replaced. And this was the model that might be extended elsewhere. Barbados, Martinique, Nevis, Guadeloupe, St. Kitts all began to produce sugar, but some islands were too dry, and some lacked anything like the rich Brazilian massa-based soils. And the Brazilian system had not been entirely forgotten. Wim Kloester has found a document that he shared with me that shows that in 1669, a group of planters, some 20 of whom were Portuguese Jews that had lived in Brazil or who had relatives that were there, petitioned the governor to have, in Suriname, to have the states of Zeeland send out servants or such persons from whom in due course lavradores can be made. That is, sharecroppers who would be able to work owning slaves, farming the cane, and supplying the cane to the mills, as was characteristic of Brazil, but which generally was not done elsewhere in the Caribbean. Here, in this particular case, we have evidence that this was a model that people had in their minds that they wished to reintroduce into the world of the Caribbean. It was to be expected that those who knew Brazil would turn to their experience as a guide for the future. And it's in this context that I want to close this discussion of the search for the new Brazil by looking for a moment at one particular instance where the experience of Dutch Brazil was clearly a determining feature in the plans for new efforts of colonization. It took place here, in this region of what the Dutch came to call the Wild Coast, the area that lays between the mouth of the Amazon and the mouth of the Orinoco rivers, and what's today made up of French Guiana, Suriname, and Guyana. This is the curious story of a project. This is Joden-Savon, which became a sugar-producing area in Suriname. But this project was created in 1659 by two men, Otto Kia and the Baron Balthasar Gerbier. This settlement, or settlements on the Essequibo and on the Wild Coast in general, had begun in the early 17th century. With the fall of Dutch Brazil, the Zeeland Chamber of the West India Company developed a plan to settle this region. Various efforts had been made there over time. And this plan of 1659 was a plan to create a second Brazil. The Dutch eventually created over 400 sugar works in Suriname, but this effort was going to be made a little bit further to the oh, I'm sorry, pressed the wrong button here. A little bit further to the east, in the area which is today French Guiana. Here at this river, Apoyac River, not far from Cayenne. Excuse me for a page out of place. Sorry. It was in the decade of the 1650s that this project to make a settlement here was created. This was an effort by a man who had lived in Dutch Brazil named Otto Kia. Kia, we don't know much about him, but we know that in the 1650s, he published a handbook called The Real Difference Between the Warm and Cold Countries. It was a promotional brochure to stimulate colonization of Suriname rather than of New Amsterdam, New York. Kia was a curious figure. He was born in Zutphen in 1611. His family, while not noble, was locally prominent. And he had gone to study law at Leiden, then to Groningen, and where he was still studying in 1639. Sometime in the following decade, he had gone into the service of the West India Company. And by 1653, he was serving as a captain of infantry in Dutch Brazil. We know little more about his life there, but he appears to have been at the fall of Recife and to have been a captive of the Portuguese and who have then returned to the United Provinces thereafter. Kia was an enthusiast for Brazil, and his experience there made him a seemingly valuable asset for other promoters of colonization. One of these was this man, Balthasar Gerbier, a Hollander from a French Huguenot family who styled himself, really without legitimate title, Baron Duvily. Gerbier was a man of some artistic and architectural talent, and here is actually a gate that was designed by Gerbier in London. But he was also a relentless self-promoter who, by his skills as an artist and architect and through his restless social networking, had crafted a career as a royal agent, art dealer, minor diplomat, and spy, both in his native Netherlands and in England, where he was in the service of the Duke of Buckingham, and was friendly with Peter Paul Rubens, who portrayed him and his family. And here, a painting of Gerbier's family by Rubens. Gerbier claimed to have access of a treasure map of gold deposits on the Wild Coast, and he successfully petitioned the States General to establish a colony on the Apoyac River in what is today French Guiana, on a stretch of coast not far from where another Dutch settlement had already been established. And here's the actual document with Gerbier's name on it. Gerbier had great ambitions, but no experience, and so he needed a man like Otto Kea. He later wrote that he had sought out Kea because the soldier gave the impression of having useful knowledge and experience, and that such a person like Otto Kea was essential for good counsel. The two partners joined forces and sailed with their colonists to Cayenne in 1660. But setting up a colony was difficult, and the two men soon quarreled. No gold was found, and eventually, in an armed confrontation between them, here's the river, one of Gerbier's daughters was killed by accident. Here's Otto Kea, the murderer, and there are Kea and Gerbier in their dispute. This is from a pamphlet that Gerbier later published in English about their dispute and the murder of his daughter. This bloody confrontation led to a scandalous trial of Kea and of the conspirators. But apparently, when Gerbier died in 1663, the case was terminated without a conviction. That's a fascinating story in itself. But what concerns me here is what Kea knew from his Brazilian experience that he hoped to transfer to the Caribbean coast of South America. We already get some idea of how Kea viewed Brazil from an account he submitted to the West India Company in 1655, suggesting that the Dutch might capture Rio de Janeiro, having lost Pernambuco. Kea reported in glowing terms what he had seen there, along with some other Dutch prisoners that had been sent there to work in the sugar mills. Kea reported that there were 67 sugar mills operating, and he had personally visited 20 of them. Although he had not determined if there were mines of silver and gold, he had seen lots of silver tableware wherever he went, so he thought the place must be rich. The picture he painted of the area around Rio de Janeiro was one of cocaine. The farinha, that is the manioc flour, was better and more beautiful here than elsewhere in Brazil. The cattle were fat. There were sheep and fine horses. Chickens, geese, and turkeys were in an abundance of game. And perhaps best of all, the place was ill-defended, and the African slaves and Native American workers were anxious to rise up against the Portuguese. Much of this was surely just promotional exaggeration, but it did fairly reflect Kea's enthusiasm for a Brazil-style colony elsewhere in the Caribbean, an enthusiasm that infuses his book, The Warm Lands and the Cold Lands. Now let me make clear that there's no evidence that Kea had ever set foot on the wild coast. So all the details of his book on setting up a farm or how to manage slaves came from his Brazilian experience. In fact, his book was prefaced by a poem dedicated to him by Kieran Spranger, who was serving the West India Company and later was made governor of a wild coast settlement. Spranger applauded Kea's enthusiasm for the warm lands, but he recognized that Kea was really not writing about the wild coast, but about Brazil, which his description transformed into a new Canaan or a new Eden, with sugar so sweet and juicy that there is none sweeter in the world. As Spranger rhymed, "Of this land where it is always April, if you want better information, either read this book or go to Brazil." That's a book about the wild coast. The point of Kea's volume was to convince potential colonists that their efforts would be better rewarded in the tropics than in cold places like New Netherlands on the banks of the Hudson River. Guyana would have the same conditions of soil and climate as those in beautiful, opulent, pleasant, and invaluable Brazil. This was a positive envision of the tropics that echoed the writings of Barleios and Pisa and Maurits of Nassau himself, all of whom had celebrated the healthy temperature and airs of Brazil, despite considerable evidence of their negative effects on the fighting effectiveness of the Dutch forces in the colony. Nevertheless, Kea's descriptions of flora and fauna display a considerable admiration that, even if we discount his promotional and propaganda intentions, reflects admiration and approval, an attitude often found in Dutch writings, and one basically absent from English consideration of the tropics. Throughout the volume, in his calculations of slave productivity and costs, agricultural output, and equipment needs, his terminology for agricultural tools, and his descriptions of how to plant sugar and other crops Kia makes clear his Brazilian experience. For example, his calculation on setting up a family farmstead depends on the accessibility of slaves, and he devotes considerable space in his text to finding biblical and political justifications for slavery, arguing that, in fact, the condition of slaves in the tropics is no worse and probably better than that of peasants in Germany or other places in Europe. Slaves may be expensive, but they will repay the investment in a short time, and little cost needs to be given to their upkeep. In fact, he suggests that slaves be given a day each week to produce their food. Evidence here, of course, of the often discussed Brazilian practice of the peasant breach, that is allowing slaves to grow their own food. His estimate was that after the first 3 months, the slaves would essentially become self-sufficient. How accurate was Kia about these things? Well, here's a little table. He says that a person needs 3.5 cana, or jugs, of manioc flour a week. That would make 182 per year. And alquire, which is the standard Portuguese grain measure, was calculated to be 22 cana. So a year's supply would have been 8.3 alquires. But beginning with Lawrence of Nassau in 1638, planters had been were required to plant a minimum of 10 alquires per slave, a calculation that was also imposed by governors in Portuguese Brazil. So basically, what you can see here is that Kana's estimates are about 20% too low. So since Kia knew something about running plantations in Brazil, the question is, did he make this underestimate as a kind of promotional come-on for the colonists to make it look easier, or was this simply a mistake that he made about the management of a farm? About the slaves themselves, Kia had little to say except that they were childlike and that enslaving them was a highly noble endeavor because they would be made Christians, and first changed from animals to humans and then from humans to Christians, and thereby pulled from the violence and service of the devil. Whether or not they become physically cooperative in exchange for the received spiritual benefaction and liberation, they should rejoice and not complain. Those are Kia's words. The dangers of slave ownership for the colonists, he thought, lay in the possibility of slave mortality and in slave flight. The former, he thought, were not a real problem, since slaves were coming from unhealthy African climes to the healthy atmosphere of America. But this was even less of a risk, since slaves quickly repaid their investment in their purchase, and that if they were provided at reasonable prices, as wisely had been the case in New Zealand and Essequibo, in those colonies, there would be not much of a problem. In Brazil, he warned, the West India Company had sold the slaves at such a high price that it ruined many people and ended up producing more damages than profits to the colony. This, of course, had been one of the problems why people had become indebted to the West India Company in Dutch Brazil, which led to the revolt of the Portuguese. As for runaways, since this was a new land and the slaves were unfamiliar with the topography and with the local Indians, and since there were no seasoned older slaves to instruct them, that is, they were starting from scratch, the risks of flight or revolt were few. In other words, the slaves would not have the home court advantage, and therefore they wouldn't be able to run away. There would be no Palmares on the Wild Coast. His colony did not last long enough for us to find out if that was true, but for the region as a whole, how wrong he was. The Maroons of Suriname were amongst the most successful of all runaway communities in the history of the Americas. And so the idea of bringing them to the Wild Coast didn't realize Kia's dream. Kia painted a picture of a tropical utopia, a land blessed by nature where others would do the labor cheaply and be thankful for their salvation. He was a false prophet. The Kia Gerbier settlement ended in a disaster with the death of Gerbier's daughter. I skipped that slide. Let me go back to it. This is actually after the encounter between Gerbier and Kia. Here, the image of his daughter, Catherine, dead. The Kia Gerber settlement ended in a disaster with the death of the daughter and Kia's arrest. It was not until 1667 that the Suriname colony further west became solidly established, where the Sephardim called it a New Jerusalem, and where it became another tropical Babylon. And then sugar moves to other places where neo-Brazils were created, like Barbados, Jamaica, Saint Domingo, and later Cuba. By the 1680s, it had become apparent to the Dutch that there were other and better ways to benefit from the economy of the tropical Atlantic. For them, Curacao and its commerce, rather than Suriname and its plantations, presented the best road to the future. Thank you. I'll be glad to take some questions. Anyone?
So it honestly knows nothing about sugar.
Yes.
When you were talking about the use of cassava, I didn't use the term anyhow, in any case, this gentleman had figured out that he needed X amount of cassava to support a slave. And yet we know now that cassava is a very impoverished, calorie-rich product. So it seems to me that there is I think I'll shout. It seems to me that his formula for supporting slaves had much more wrong with it than just a mathematical error.
Yeah. Generally, cassava was used as a staple. It's got lots of calories, but not much else that's good in it. It's also it's got the one advantage that it has is that it's less susceptible to environmental damage, especially in the Caribbean. So as a root crop, you don't have to harvest it at a particular time. So it was used a lot in Brazil to feed slaves, and it became the basic foodstuff, and was supplemented by them by shellfish, fish, whatever meat they could find. But it still is, kind of in the northeastern part of Brazil, it still is a major staple for them. He doesn't seem to be much, he thinks that the climate of the wild coast will be like the climate of Brazil. But one of the things that we know is that the Guianas, we've got some studies from the 17th century in the Guianas that show that the mortality levels were very, very high for Europeans and for slaves in early stages. And so that's just Kia's exaggeration. He really doesn't know the wild coast. So he's really transporting what he knows about Brazil to explain the wild coast. Yes, Dan.
I have two questions about our first map. The first question would be interesting to integrate into the large Caribbean area the Atlantic Islands, which might have a similar, especially Madeira or Cape Verde, that might have a similar experience. Can you hear me?
I didn't hear it. You said it would be interesting to integrate the what?
The Atlantic Islands,
Yeah.
Madeira, Cape Verde. I'm not sure about the Azores, but which somehow they make part of the same story.
Let me go back to the islands here.
And if you see any difference between the areas that have an immediate interland, or could the mainland serve as a hinterland for the islands? For instance, North America for Barbados.
Ah, I see, yeah.
Suriname.
Yeah. Well, I think it's true that each of the sugar colonies depended on the mainland colonies of the same imperial nation. So the French supplied wood, for example, and products like that to to Martinique and Guadeloupe, just as the English North American colonies provided stuff to Barbados. In the case of the Dutch were able to supply their own colony, but of course the Dutch are also thought to have been much involved in the development of the sugar industry in places outside of their national control. So that part is true. And is that respond to the question? Yeah. Okay. So yes.
So as far as I recall, in the 19th century U.S., the prices of slaves and cotton sort of track each other with really close precision. So I was really interested that the price of sugar and the price of slaves in Brazil in the 17th century are sort of moving in opposite directions.
Yeah.
Could you sort of talk about, so you talk about a lot of
Yeah, so what happens is when the price of sugar begins to, maybe I should go to that slide of the sugar prices.
This is working now.
Yeah. So the price of sugar kind of goes up in the 1630s and 40s, and that's basically when sugar gets introduced into the Caribbean islands, and then the price of sugar kind of reaches a height in those years, and then it drops off considerably, and that's partially because these other islands are coming online at this time. Right? So by the end of the 40s and 50s, you begin getting sugar from the French and British islands that is coming into Europe, and so it's lowering the price. But at the same time, these places now need more labor, and so the price of slaves begins to go up. And the Portuguese, of course, in the period between 1580 and 1640 had been the main suppliers of slaves in the Americas. They had controlled the African ports, but now, as I mentioned, the Dutch began to go after their own African ports, and there's now competition on that coast. And so the price of slaves is going up, and the price of sugar is coming down because of added supply. Now here, let me just make a comment. Some of you who are historians of sugar, there has to be made a distinction between the price of sugar in Europe and the price of sugar at the mill in the Americas. Because what happens is Brazil begins to get into a position where the flourishing of its sugar industry is exactly opposite to the flourishing of the sugar industries in the Caribbean. Whenever there's a war on in the Caribbean, Brazil, it opens the market for Brazilian sugar, and Brazilians do better. When there's peace in the Caribbean, when the French and the English aren't shooting each other, and thus the sugar is going back to their markets more readily, that's bad for Brazilian production. So there's this distinction always between the situation between France and England and the market capability of Brazil. They exist in the kind of relationship. And that's why that figure that I showed of this map, I think is kind of useful. We often think of the Atlantic world now and take into consideration that North America and the Caribbean have to be thought of together. But we haven't thought much in terms of the South Atlantic's relationship to the Caribbean. And in this case, I think Brazil really was the model that people had in their mind of one of these kind of plantation regimes. And so they became the model and the pattern, but at the same time the competitor. And so idea that the sugar or expertise was brought from Brazil to Barbados, which Ligon mentions and has often been expanded on, is certainly a possibility. But I want to also suggest that there are some questions that I still have about it. Many of the people that left Dutch Brazil, especially the Sephardic Jews that left Dutch Brazil, some went back to Amsterdam or to Livorno, others went to New Amsterdam or to New York, but some went to the Caribbean. And they created the plantation colony in Suriname, along with people coming from Holland itself. But many of these people, in fact, had not been owners of plantations in Brazil, nor, in fact, even when they were, knew much about the technical operation of those plantations. And so the idea that somehow the Sephardic Jews arrived in Barbados and taught people how to grow sugar, I'm doubtful of that. There's very little evidence, for example, of sugar technicians, of the kind of artisans that worked in the sugar plantations among that population. Most of these people were in trade, and some did come to own plantations, but they probably didn't manage those plantations themselves. I think that's often an exaggeration, and that's why I said in the talk that we think we know this story pretty well, but I've got my doubts whether we do in fact. In any case, if you think about this as a kind of greater Caribbean, which takes in the coast of Africa and extends as far as Morelos, Mexico, or Peru, where they also grew sugar, more for internal consumption, I think that that's a fair way to think about the South Atlantic, and that Brazil is really part of that, and that at the time there was a kind of realization of that, and it's certainly demonstrated in the Caribbean in various documents where people talk specifically about creating a new Brazil. And I gave a few examples of governors in places like Barbados and Martinique talking specifically about neo-Brazils, new Brazils, in this attempt to expand it. And even in a way, the attempt by Gerbier and Kia, which had this as a basis, a search for mines, was in effect a kind of search for a new Brazil avant la lettre, because Brazil hadn't found its mines yet at this period, but was looking for them already, because this was a period of kind of economic crisis in Europe, and everybody was looking for specie. And so, in that sense, the attempt of Gerbier and Kia was also a reproduction of Brazil.
Now that we have a working microphone, I think we will call the question and answer session over. It seems sort of appropriate. I was going to ask a question myself about whether or not the translation of books and manuals into different kinds of languages might add to and corroborate the argument you made, but I think I'll wait to actually do that, surrounded by those very books and manuals at the Macmillan Reading Room. Please join us over there. But before that, let's just thank Stuart Schwartz one more time.